Perfect. Okay. So, hello and welcome to the first session for Shuluk Ignite for the web development course. So I'm excited to have everybody here, and yeah, we'll get started learning about web development. So first things first, we'll just talk about what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a web page, the different parts that make up a web page, and how they all fit together. And then we're going to talk about HTML and CSS today. And then we're also going to talk about how to actually sort of take apart existing websites and understand what's actually happening on those websites using some of the built-in tools that are available in your browser. So first things first, if you're not sure where to find any of the slides or files, so the slides are available on the Shuluk Ignite website. So if we actually just click on this link right here, you can see if you just go under sessions and then Ignite Web Dev, the slides are just right available here. And then on top of that, there's also the exercise files which are available on GitHub that you can download for right there. Okay. So we're also just going to give a quick sneak peek for what's to come. So by the end of session 2, we're going to have something built like this. So we're going to be going through how to do some of the fancy CSS stuff that makes this possible. And then by the end of session 3, we're going to be building out a nice and fancy website. And by session 4, we'll be building out a little bit fancier website with some of the fancier actual in-page features and stuff like that built out. So let's get started with the anatomy of a web page. So when you actually head to any pages, there's a couple of questions that sort of come across your mind. First of all, how does the browser actually know what to show you? Where does it know where to actually get the content? And also then what to actually do with that content to actually have it show up? When you search for something, how does the actual search text that you have on your browser actually get to a server? How does it come back with a response? All that sort of stuff. And then, yeah, again, like I said, what does it actually do once it actually receives all this information? So that's basically what we're going to try and cover throughout this course. And to start off with, the question is, what's a web page? So basically, what we call a web page is typically a combination of a couple of different languages that exist that are working together to help everything actually show up on your browser. So the first language is going to be HTML. This kind of defines the structure, sort of like what's actually on the web page. And then the actual, the way that it looks, kind of like what the sort of like the colors and all that sort of stuff, all the sizes of like the fonts and everything like that, is typically defined by the CSS. And then whatever is actually happening on the page is defined by the JavaScript. So, you know, when you actually type something into Google search and there's like those auto results that show up on the page, that sort of stuff, that's typically powered by JavaScript. So to get started, we're going to talk about the basics of HTML. Oh, and one important thing as well with these is that HTML and CSS themselves aren't programming languages. They're just sort of display languages, so all they control is what shows up. JavaScript is an actual programming language, so it does have actual sort of programming logic and all that sort of stuff. HTML and CSS, there's no actual like programming stuff that you do. It's basically just telling the browser what should show up. And so with that, let's get started with HTML. So like I said earlier, it defines the structure and the content of the web page. So when you're looking at any page, it's typically whatever the nouns are that are on the page. So for example, this blue block of text that's available there would be defined by the HTML, and it has an image underneath it. Those sorts of like chunks of content are defined by the HTML, essentially. So if we're looking at this, for example, they're broken up into elements with HTML. So in this case, this is what's called an H1 element, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And this would be an image element. It's down there. And so each HTML element itself has a couple of different parts to it. So it has a start and an end tag. It has some inner content, which is typically optional, and it has some attributes. And so the way that that looks, so actually, as we're going through, we're going to be giving you all these different HTML elements. And as we're going through, if you want, you can go ahead and build out a page. And so I'll just quickly show you how to start that, just because we're going to be going through and talking about different elements as we go. So you can start actually working with the elements as we're going through it. So if you guys have the files downloaded, you can see if you go inside of day 1, if you just go inside of like this main day 1 folder, if you're on Windows, you can typically right click and just go open with code since we've installed VS Code. Or if you're on a different system, you can just open up your Visual Studio Code itself. Just waiting for it to open. Sorry, I had some stuff open in the background. I just have to close out of it. And basically, once you do that, what you can do is you can just pop open your Visual Studio Code and go open folder, and then just find the folder that you want to work on. So in our case, it's going to be on the desktop, and it's going to be under the web files. And day 1. And once you select that, it'll open up a window like this. And from here, what you can do, you can pick wherever you want to go, and you can just hit create a file. And basically, you can name it whatever you want. Just make sure that it ends in .html. So we can say hello.html in our case, for example. And as long as you see these little tags show up here, you're good to go. So I'll just give everybody a second to do that. And then basically what we're going to be building towards is something that looks kind of like this. So basically, as we're going to go through, we're going to show you how to build out these different tags and how to build out pages that look something like this as we're going. And if you're looking for these examples, by the way, whenever you're looking at any of these slides, you can see here, there'll be little text that's highlighted, and that will essentially tell you where you can find the content that we're looking at here. So if you want to ever see any of our examples, you can find them. In this case, it would be under whatever day we're currently on. So in this case, it's under day 1 right here, and it's under examples. And you can find them in here. So motivating example and motivating example 2. Alrighty. So like I was saying, HTML elements and the syntax of how they work. So to create an element, like I said, you're going to have a start tag and an end tag. So that's these things right here. So you can see there's these angled brackets that are right here with some stuff inside them. So essentially this first part right here is what we refer to as the start tag. And then inside it is what's called the tag name. So in this case, where you have these 2 angle brackets like this, and then you have the H1 inside here, this is the start tag of an H1, and the actual tag itself is called, the tag name is called the H1 right here. And then on top of that, at the end, you can see here, it's basically the same thing, except for we add a slash. And this basically tells the browser where to end your stuff. So essentially, as you're going through and you're telling it, it's kind of like the same thing as if you're in regular programming, you have strings, for example. Like with a string, obviously you have to have the start of the string with some quotes, but you also have to have the end of a string with some quotes. It's kind of the same idea with HTML. You have something like this, where you have H1 like that to say that this is where it's starting, and then this is where it's ending as well. And then the stuff inside of it is what would actually show up, or it's called the inner content. So in this case, the element that we're using here is called an H1 element. And what this does is with any of the inner text that's inside here, it will show up as kind of some large text when we're going through. So with that, we're just going to go through some of the common tags that exist. So the first tag is a paragraph tag. So this is basically just your simple plain text. So if we go back to our current page that we have right here, and we just go and we say P, and we say hello world. What we can do now is if we pull up our file, so our file lives inside of our day 1 folder right here, and it's an HTML file. We go ahead and open that up. We'll see here, hello world. You can see it's very small because we're using a paragraph tag, which is very small text. So this is usually what shows up when you have like your main text in a website, because obviously you don't want all of your text to be really big. So this is typically what's used for sort of your main text inside of a website, and your main sort of content is often going to be inside of a paragraph tag. From there, we have what we heard about before, which is heading tags. So heading tags go from 1 to 6, and they get smaller as you go down. So heading 1 is the largest, and it goes all the way down to heading 6, and it gets basically incrementally smaller as you go. So if we're taking a look at this example here, so we have the hello world in a paragraph tag that we saw before, but instead we can do H1, and we can say this is a block of text. And then if we go back to our page really quickly, and we refresh, you'll see at the top here, it's much bigger than our paragraph, which is at the bottom. So, and then as we're going, if we have different elements like this, so if we go ahead and we say, for example, an H2 instead, then we can see here, it's getting smaller as we're going. And that goes all the way down to H6. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is what's called attributes. So if you remember from your previous programming experience that you have, if you talk about classes and objects, essentially objects would have these things called attributes, which is basically like the data that's associated with a certain object. And HTML elements actually have the same sort of idea. In fact, under the hood, they are actually objects, and then they have their own attributes that you can assign to them. So in this case, for example, if we're talking about anchor links, which is, or anchor tags rather, which is essentially the link that's used. So whenever you go on a page, and you can see, for example, this is a hyperlink that we can click on to go to somewhere. That essentially uses this thing that shows up right here. So if we're taking a look at it, we have an anchor tag like this. So that's just an A. And we can see here, we can put stuff inside here. So we can say like, click me, for example. This won't actually do anything because we have to tell it what link we want to send it to. And so we can do that by adding in an attribute. So in this case, the attribute is called href. And it's basically just you say attribute equals, and then whatever the value is. Basically, all of them are going to be strings whenever you're going through. And so we can just say, for example, in this case, https://schulichignite.com, for example. And then if we go ahead and we refresh this, you can see here we have a click me. And if I go ahead and click that, it'll take me to schulichignite.com. So attributes are going to be used in several different elements, and they can be used for a bunch of other stuff. And they're basically just the same as attributes that you would use in regular classes, where they just basically have some sort of data, and that data can be used for things. And so with that, we have anchor tags. Like I was just saying, the main thing that's on this slide that's a little bit different is that there's also another attribute that you can add to anchor tags called a target. And what this can be handy for is if we're taking a look at our text or our page as it currently is, whenever I click it, you'll notice it takes me to Shulk Ignite, but it's actually replaced the page that we're on right now. So we can see Shulk Ignite in this case, but we actually, if we want to see the page that we were previously on, we have to go ahead and we have to click it back in order to see this page. So what if we wanted to open in a new tab on the same browser? Well, then we can add another attribute called target. And so in this case, a lot of the times as you're typing, by the way, with VS Code, one of the reasons we recommend VS Code is because it has a lot of these things built in. So you can see here, it's already found target for me. So I only have to type like this, and then I can hit enter, and it'll actually autofill with a whole bunch of these suggestions. So in our case, basically, whenever you're using anchor tags, you might use blank or you'll use nothing. The underscore blank here basically says open it in a new tab. So if we go ahead and refresh that and click it now, you'll see it actually opens up in a new tab. Okay, so as we've seen so far, you can have just sort of your elements that have the content inside of them. So if we take a look at this before, we have just our regular sort of elements with our content inside them. But we can actually put elements inside of elements. So we often call this nesting. So essentially the inner content that's inside an element can be nested together with other elements inside of it. So a good use for this, for example, is as you can see here, we have an H1, and then we put an anchor tag inside of it, and then we have the content there. And what that will actually do is, as you can see down here, or maybe as you can't see right now, this anchor tag is really small, right? The text inside of it is really small and really hard to read. So what we can actually do is we can actually put another tag around it, like a heading tag, to make it larger. So in this case, for example, we can say H2, and then we can just take our ending tag and put it on the other end of our anchor tag like that. And if we go ahead and refresh it, now we have the same anchor tag inside, but it's now H2 size text. So now it's much bigger, much easier to see. And so we can do that with basically any element. We can nest things inside of them. Some of them don't make sense. Some of them don't necessarily like do things if you nest things inside of them. It kind of depends on the context and what the actual elements are that you're using. But a very common one is like I showed you just there, where you have a heading tag and then you have an anchor tag inside of it. And there's a couple other ones that we'll talk about a little bit later. And there's actually two different types of inner content as we're going through this. So there's the inner text, which is what we've seen so far, which was the just having this text, for example, inside of this anchor tag. And there's inner content. And so, for example, with this H2 tag, the inner text of this H2 tag would be this click me, because that's just the text that shows up. But then the inner content of the H2 tag is everything inside there. This won't matter as much now, but this might matter when we're talking about JavaScript later on. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to do our first quick question, which is going to show up on the Zoom as a poll. And it's just going to be a question about what are the elements here and what are their attributes? So I'll give you guys a moment just to try and answer that question. Okay, I think we're good on the poll at that point. So yeah, so element wise, in this case, there's a div and an H1. There's also actually an anchor in here. I think this was just, it wasn't quite caught correctly, but yeah, there's actually an anchor tag as well in there. And then for attributes wise, for the div, we have the attribute 1 right here. And then for the anchor, we have an href and we have a target attribute right there as well. So as we're going through, those are basically the attributes and the divs, the attribute and the elements for this question. So now here's another question. What are the elements here and their attributes? So we're just gonna do the same thing with the poll. Okay, I think that's everyone. I'm not sure if they're not showing up for me. I think the formatting might have broken a little bit on these questions. Sorry about that, guys. This is the first time that we've run this, so the questions might be a bit off. Yeah, so in this case, there's 3 different attributes. So there's the div, there's the H1, and the anchor. And sorry, that's the 3 different elements. And then the attributes are the hidden attribute on the div, there's the href, and then there's the target on the anchor. Apologies, I think because these had spaces when we input them, I think there's just a little bit of some of the stuff that's breaking there as it's showing up. But here's an interesting question for you. What do you guys think is going to show up when people, like when we actually type this HTML in? Like, what do you guys think is going to show up? You can just type in the chat. What do you think is going to show up? Yep, it's a good guess. Yeah, okay. Looks like the trick question didn't catch anybody. So in this case, basically nothing would show up. And the reason for that is that when you're nesting something, one of the main reasons why you nest things is because essentially anything that's inside these elements will suffer whatever consequences come from higher up. So for example, in this case, so whenever we talk about this, we have to talk about it in like parent-child relationships. So in this case, the div would be the parent to these child elements inside here. And anything that happens at this level will also what's called cascade down to any of the ones underneath. So in this case, because hidden exists here, the consequences of this div being hidden would then cascade itself down into the other elements that are there. So nothing would actually show up when you try and put this in there. Okay, so images as well are another tag that we have in there. It's a pretty common one that shows up. So essentially, it'll allow you to put in any images with any of the supported formats. So there's a ton of formats right here. Keep in mind, some formats are specific to some browsers. Most browsers these days are pretty similar, but just keep that in mind if you're using any of the fancier ones down the road. But essentially, all that you have in this case is just a start tag. You actually don't need an end tag with an image because it can't have anything that goes inside. You're not able to actually put any other stuff inside of an image tag. So in this case, you actually don't need to have an end tag for an image. And then basically there is just the source right here, and then you just put in whatever you want. So in this case, it can be a URL, which is like it is right here, or it can be a file path if you have images in the same file location as the HTML file that you're creating. And they can also be relative paths, which if you know what that is, then that should be helpful. If you don't worry about it. But let's just take a look at what this looks like. And I'll actually show you a trick whenever you're working with HTML. There is a system that's actually built into VS Code called Emmet. And what it does is it lets you actually type HTML really quickly. So instead of what we've been doing so far, you can actually just do things like if you type in IMG, for example, which is the image tag, you can see here there's a lot of abbreviations that show up. So in our case, we can do this one, which is IMG:S. And what that'll do is that'll actually create one that has a source for us here. We don't have to worry about source set. We're just going to worry about source in this case. And then basically this is where we would put our content. So in this case, if we go to this URL and take a look, we can see here that there's a huge Ignite logo right here. And so what we can do is we can just paste that in there like that. And then now if I refresh, we can see we also now have a huge Ignite logo in there. And you can do that basically with any of the other stuff. So I've been typing out the H2s and everything like that manually, but if I wanted to do, for example, H2, and then I just hit enter, and then I start typing stuff in, it'll just let me do that. And you can see here the end tag goes afterwards. So it's just a way of running stuff a little bit faster as you're going through and running your HTML. Okay, so our next HTML tag is lists. So there's actually a couple of different ones. So the two main ones are going to be unordered list or ordered lists, which is basically corresponding to sort of like 1, 2, 3, 4, or bullet point lists, which is kind of called unordered lists. There's actually a couple of other ones like definition lists and some other stuff like that. They're not really used very much, so we didn't include them in here, but you can take a look at them later on if you want to Google them yourselves. But they all basically follow the same sort of pattern, which is there's going to be an outer list tag, and then there's going to be inner list items. So if we go ahead and take a look at ordered lists, for example, we can see here OL is the outer list item. And in this case, that's the ordered list. Sorry, O doesn't stand for outer, it stands for ordered. But this is the outer list element. And then inside that, there is the list item elements that are in there. And that's what shows up. So if we go ahead and we take a look at this, and we, for example, have an OL, and then inside that, we have some LIs. Let's say, for example, we have, this is, say, eggs. Like that. Let me say ham and spam. And then we were to say that this was our shopping list. Like that. If we go ahead and now we refresh our page, at the very bottom, past all of the massive images, you can see here we have the shopping list. And then down at the very bottom right here, I'll zoom in a little bit, we can see 1, 2, 3. And that's because we picked an ordered list. And then we have eggs, which is one of our list items, then ham, then spam. So that's an ordered list. And then if we change this this O to a U, then that would be an unordered list. And at that point, it would just be a bullet point like that. So, and then, yeah, this just talks about the same thing. So unordered list is the exact same idea, except for the outer list changes. Essentially, the outer list element changes, but the inner content can stay the same. And then the next thing is something that we've already seen a little bit of, which is divs. So divs are basically used to house or group elements. So if you want to put a ton of stuff inside of a div, then what you can do with it is, like we were showing before, let's say, for example, that we didn't want this image or the shopping list to show up. Then what we could do is we could have a div in here, for example. We could wrap it like this. And if we go ahead and come back here and we refresh, you see it looks exactly the same. But now, because everything is wrapped inside of one div element like this, we can do what we saw before, where we say hidden is equal to true, like that. And now when we refresh, all those elements disappear all at once. So we can change what shows up super easily because everything is now grouped together. So divs are super handy for doing that. They basically allow you to block off different sections. Some other HTML stuff there's some other ones that you can use that are similar to this. Span is another one that'll do similar sorts of things. And another one that you might see is section as well. They do similar sorts of things. There's small differences between them, but they essentially do the same thing. The idea is you want to group content together. Okay. And then on top of that, we also have comments in HTML. So as you're going through, if you want to let people know what's going on in your code, you can just put that in there. You can just say things like, this is my shopping list. And all you need to do for that is go as if you were going to start a tag. So you just basically have the first angle bracket. You then just put an exclamation point, and then it's going to be 2 dashes. And then basically everything you write up until these last 2 dashes and the end is going to be a comment. So anything you put in there is all good to go, but you do have to have these last 2 dashes and then the end right there. Otherwise, if I delete this and I didn't have this comment down below, you see everything would be commented out. In VS Code, if you want to do something quickly, like you want to comment some stuff out quickly, so instead of doing this div hidden, you want to just comment out all this code, you can actually just highlight all the lines you need to, and you can press Control, and then right next to your right shift, the slash that's down there, right where the question mark is, that'll automatically comment it out for you, and you can do that in a row. So there are some other advanced tags that you can take a look at. We're not going to dive into some of these extra ones just because going through just HTML tags is kind of boring, and also just because these are a little bit more complicated. But if you're interested, there's some links here for information about how to do forms, labels, and inputs, tables, format tags. So if you want to do like italics and stuff like that, then there's 2 different tags. EM is for italics and strong is for bold. And then detail summary tags. There's a ton of other ones. There's hundreds of different HTML tags. So we're not going to go through all of them right now. But so far what we've done is we've just sort of had some code kind of hanging out here like this, and it's just sort of been here. And then when we refresh, it just sort of says, like in the top here, we have hello.html, and then we just have our content inside here. But the browser is actually doing some work for us here. The browser is basically trying to guess at what you wanted to do, and it's actually added a ton of things in for us. Mostly the main thing that's added in is a whole bunch of what's called metadata, which is basically data about your file, including what you want the title at the top of your page to be. And all that stuff has been added in for you. But it's actually often better to just include this information yourself. So we have actually included a file in here that has all of it like ready to go. But you can also do it really quickly by in VS Code, you can type in HTML:5. And if you hit enter, it'll add in all the things that we're going to be talking about for you. So if you already have a file that you're working on, basically you can do that. And then you can just go ahead and you can copy your content and put your content inside of where it says body. It's right here. And that's basically what the browser's been doing for us. It's just been copying and pasting the stuff in for you. The reason why this matters is mostly because there's actually a couple different parts to an HTML document. So this first part here where it says doc type, don't worry about this. Every time you do this is going to be HTML, essentially. This is only for some other fancier sort of setups that you might need, where you might need to change this. But 9 times out of 10, actually 9.5 times out of 10, it's pretty much always going to be HTML for you, unless you're doing something fancy. You then have to add in an actual HTML element. And in that case, the only thing that really matters here is that it says lang is equal to English. The reason why this matters is so that Google, if it's showing up on a browser, can tell people who don't speak English to automatically translate the page so that they know what language it is. This stuff doesn't necessarily matter, but the one that we will be talking about is title. So title is what shows up here. So if I go ahead and I actually refresh this page now, you can see here it says document. So anything that shows up in your in the top here is going to be affected by what's inside this head section here. So inside here, if I were to say, for example, some site, and then refresh, we can see here at the top, it's now been replaced to my awesome site. And that's basically the main thing in the head. There are some other fancier things that you can do in the head, but that's going to be the main thing. Also, when we talk about CSS, if you're putting any CSS in there, you're going to put it in this head as well. And then the body is where your HTML and your JavaScript is going to go from there. And so that's basically where all of your content goes, is essentially in the body. So yeah, and essentially this is just where your metadata goes. There's some other stuff as well that you can look into with this. We actually didn't put any links to this, but if you are interested, there's stuff called Open Graph and a bunch of other things that exist for the metadata that's kind of helpful. Open Graph controls whenever you post links on Twitter and stuff like that, when you see those images that pop up, like the banners that pop up whenever you share links and stuff like that, that's actually part of your meta tags and all that sort of stuff. It's basically information about your page essentially goes in the head, and then the actual content itself goes in the body, and then your CSS stuff also goes in the head as well. Okay, so we basically covered all of this already. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take any of the content that we've been writing as we've been going and putting it inside there. That's what I just showed you. But what I'm going to also do at this point is, like I said before, we're going to build out, you can build out a page of whatever you want. So if you want to take a chance to build out a page that has information about yourself or information about like a character from like a book or whatever you want, then basically this is your chance to go ahead and try and build it out. And if you have any questions, you can ask your mentors. We can maybe do a breakout room for 2 or 3 minutes here just to try that out, and then we can go from there. Okay, I think we have everybody back now. So, all right. So that was HTML. Now we're going to talk about CSS. So HTML, like I said before, was the structure and sort of the content of a page. CSS instead is going to be sort of how it looks. So if HTML is the nouns, like the fact that there is a block of text and that there is an image, then CSS is going to be our adjectives or our describing words. So for example, that blue block of text, the fact that it's blue would be the CSS. And then that it's 3 EM, which is the size of the font, and the fact that the image is 250 pixels tall underneath, for example, that would be the CSS part of this. So there's 3 different options for how to use CSS. So the first is inline, the second is going to be style tags, and the third is going to be separate files. We're going to talk about all 3 as we're going here. So the first one is inline. So basically what this means is that you write the CSS rather directly into the element that you want. So for example, if we come back to the code that we had earlier, so if I go on here, for example, and I'm taking a look, you can see here, this is my H1 tag at the top here. If I come back to here and I say, for example, style, and then equals, and then I can just start writing some CSS. So I can say, for example, color should be red. And so the way that it works is you put whatever the name of the style is on the left-hand side, you then put a colon, and then you put whatever the content is on the right-hand side, so whatever the value should be. And always make sure to end these with a semicolon. So if I say color red, for example, and then I refresh, you can see now our text is red. And if I wanted to make this larger, for example, I could just say font size is, and then as you can see, the autocomplete shows up for us. We can say, for example, extra, extra large like that. Make sure to end it with a semicolon. And then now when I refresh here, well, it's about the same size, but we make it a little bit larger. Let's say, for example, 3 EM, which is what we were talking about before. I'll explain in a moment. You can see here, now it's a bit bigger. And so as we're going through, one of the things that I'll mention just before we start talking about CSS more directly is that there are a ton of different CSS styles. There's also the same sort of idea with elements. So we're going to cover a couple of them today. But if you are interested, you can always pretty much always find more. I'm always learning about more different ones that exist as well. So we're just going to talk about sort of the basics of them today. So the second method that we can use is, instead of doing what we did before, we can actually put it all inside one area. The reason why this is handy is, if you can imagine here, if you imagine that we did this, let's say we do this for all these different tags, right? Let's say we put it here, put one here, put it here. And then let's say we make one of these blue, for example. Now, obviously for VS Code, it's going to highlight it for us. But let's say, for example, that one of these was larger for some reason. Let's say this one was like 8 EM. And then we go ahead and we refresh the page. You can see here, well, one of them now is a different color. Well, why is that happening? Or one of them's different size, rather. You can see this one's way bigger. Why is that happening? Well, if everything is all in line like this, trying to find it is kind of hard. It's also like repeating the same content over and over again. So what we can do instead is we can actually put it inside of what's called a style tag. So if we go ahead and we delete all of these, just like that, and just like that. Then what we can do is, at the top here in our head, we can open a new tab, or new tag called style. And then in here, we can now create some CSS. And the way that this works is, previously when we were doing it inline, we don't have to specify like where it should be, because obviously it knows where it should be because it should be part of the element. But here we have to be able to select the element, and there's a ton of different ways of doing that. One of the easiest ways is if we just say, for example, let me select all of the H2s that are on the page. So I can say H2, I can put some curly braces there. And then now I can write the same CSS that I was writing before in the actual element itself, but I can write it right here. So I can say H2, and I can say color red, for example, like that. And then I can say, let's say font size is, let's say 5em, just like that, and make sure always again to end it with the semicolon. If you delete this and you see this now has a bunch of errors, more likely than not, 9 times out of 10, when you see errors like this, it's because you forgot a semicolon. So just make sure to put a semicolon in there. And then now if we refresh the page here, we can see here that the H2 is showing up and it's larger. So if we go ahead and take a look at this, the last option then is files. It's essentially the exact same thing that we did with this style tag, except for we put it into a separate file called whatever you want.css. So in our case, we could do something like test.css, like that. We could move all of this content into there. And then we could say something like, if we start typing in the word link, which is another tag, and if we actually just like this one that says CSS, it'll autofill everything for us, except for the name. So then we just change the name to test. And now what it's saying is link to a style sheet, which is what CSS is. It stands for cascading style sheets. And then we just say test.css. And in this case, if we refresh, we end up with exactly the same stuff. I'm going to go back to using styles for the time being, just because it's easier to explain. But the file is always an option as well. And if you see this dot, by the way, and then dot slash, this basically just means the same thing that I just showed you there, where it says in the same folder, find a file called file.css. Okay, so we're going to talk about CSS selection. So like I was saying before, there's a ton of different ways to select elements with CSS. So like I showed you, you can do it by H2. So for example, we picked all of the tags that have H2 tags and then targeted them, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. So this is the full reference guide is down here, but we're just going to go through a couple of them really quickly here. So the first one is by tag name, which is what we've seen. For example, this would select all of the H1 tags that are somewhere. So for example, when we're taking a look at this, every one of these H1 tags is now this size because of the fact that we selected all of them, or in this case, it would be H2 tags rather, sorry, are all this size because we selected all of the H2 tags in this case. And so what if we wanted to select just specific elements to change, as opposed to just saying all of the elements that are of this particular tag? I want to like select specific ones. Well, there's a couple of different options. So the main one is going to be class. This is what you'll find for most of them. And what this is there's an attribute that you can apply called class. So let me just come in here now. And let's say, for example, instead of saying H2 here, let's say that we make this H1 tag and this H2 tag. Let's say we add the word class here and we start typing something in. So let's say, for example, text-red is going to be our class. And then what we can do here is we can just say dot text-red. And then let's say we say color red. So what this is going to do is this dot basically means, well, you can actually see it shows up here. It says it's going to select any element that has a class that is equal to text-red. So in this case, any class or any elements in here that have text-red are going to show up as red. So if we come back to our site and we refresh, you can see now the H1 and the H2 are both red and everything else is still as it was before. So classes is where you're going to find a ton of things. Now, the thing that's important is to keep in mind is that you can put different classes and you can have multiple classes on any element. So if we're going down here, let's say we have ones like text large, for example, instead. So text large, and then let's say we say the font size is going to be 4em, which is just basically, we're just going to say that just means big for right now. Then what we can do here is we could say this one is going to be text large as well. As long as there's a space, then this means that this is a new class that's being added. And what I can do here is I can copy this. Let's say we put this on the paragraph tag, but we get rid of the text red. So now this one's going to be red, this one's going to be red and large, and this one's going to be large. So now if we refresh, it's exactly what we get. This one's large and red, and this one's just red. So that's how classes work in CSS. The other option is ID. Keep in mind that IDs are another attribute you can add, but you should only have one in the page, because what will happen is that anything that you do in the page, it'll only listen to the last ID that's there. So if I put an ID here, so let's say, for example, this H1, I say that the ID is equal to main text, for example. What I can do now is instead of the dot, I can put a hash. So I can say hash main dash text like that. And then now let's say I say the font size for this is going to be like really big. Let's say, I don't know, like 15em. It's going to be a huge piece of text. Now, if I refresh, it'll show up really big like that. But the thing with IDs is that IDs should only be on one element. So as you're going through, you can't add multiple IDs to this element. There should only be one element that has this ID on it. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. Now, the question then comes up, well, what happens if you want to select something that's inside something else? So let's say, for example, that we have this, this paragraph tag, but let's say that we were to put it inside of a div. So let's say we have like a div here, then we have a paragraph tag inside that. And then let's say we get rid of the rest of this stuff. And let's say that we have a paragraph tag that's just right here that has some stuff in it, right? So now what happens if we want to try to select just the paragraph tags that exist inside of a div? Well, there's a couple different options, but the easiest one that most people end up doing is we can actually just put div, and then we can do space, and then we can do whatever the next tag name is as well. So we can say essentially anytime that there's a div that has a paragraph tag inside of it, you can see right here, any div that has a paragraph tag inside of it, make it, I don't know, let's say color is orange. And then now if we refresh and scroll down, the paragraph tag down here is orange, but the one right here is not. Is everybody able to read this text easily, by the way, or do you guys want me to make this larger? Just wondering. That's fine. Okay. Why use an ID instead of a class? So ID has a couple of different things. Mostly what we'll see with JavaScript is where IDs get important. So IDs specifically, if you know that there's only one of them on the page, it's very handy if you know that there's going to be a unique piece of content on the page. So if you make something an ID, you're basically saying this thing only exists once on the page. So you know that that's going to be there just one time, which is very handy when you're doing some sort of logic stuff down the road, which you'll see. And also another side note as well, with IDs, you can, IDs for input boxes as well. With IDs also, there's something called in-page anchors. And so basically, I can show you what it looks like in here. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to link to somebody to this port right here, like this paragraph tag right here. I can say ID is equal to, let's just say 1, so the word 1 right here. What I can do is I can refresh here. And if I put #1 at the end and hit, oh, well, this isn't going to work because I'm not scrolling. But if I zoom this in, and then refresh, it'll actually drag me down the page to here. So basically when you say #1 in this case, it actually becomes a link itself, which is also handy whenever you need to use that. This is a bad example because I have to zoom in to show it off, but yeah. Yeah, the Wikipedia link, that's exactly what it is, yeah. Okay, so we have another quick question here. So how could we make all of this text red? You guys might have to try that one out. Okay, so I think everybody is back now. Yeah, looks like we're good. Okay. So what did everybody try when they were trying to get all this text to be read? What are some approaches that you guys took? You can just type them in the chat. Same time, I will copy this text. Out of spite, individual inline. Okay, yeah, fair enough. So yeah, so we'll try out the first one there by TJ. So I'll just grab that code and I'll check in there. So this is TJ's solution. So basically go and target the class for the text red and then make the div also color set to red. So if we go ahead and we refresh now, yeah, that basically got everything to be red. The other option in there was to add an extra class and then probably go through and target those classes. So that also works. Another cheekier option, if you want to target literally everything in here, you can also add a star, which basically means do this to everything that's in there. That's another option to do it. Bad call to do that a lot of the times because boy, will it cause problems, but it does work. So yes, this is basically the point of this is that there are a ton of different ways to go about doing this. There's not just one way of doing CSS. There's often a bunch of different ways that have different trade-offs and different consequences for doing them. So just keep in mind when you're going about doing this, that if it works at the end of the day, you've got it correct. So, all right. So what we have here are just some examples of those similar sorts of sites that we did from the last example that we had. But what we've done here is we've done a bunch of CSS to them to make them look a little bit different. And so what we're going to do is we're going to get you to go through And yeah, exactly. There's a million ways to code something. All of them are equally wrong. And so what we're going to get you guys to do is just go through and create a page and then add some styling to it yourself. So there's a couple of things that we recommend changing, for example. So one of them is background color. So going through and changing your background color, shockingly enough, it changes your background color. So if you go through and do that, it'll make your background whatever the color is that you want there. Your color, like we've seen before, will change the color of whatever text you have inside there. The font family is one that would be interesting that you can see. So essentially the font family, if we change this, for example, to font family, what this basically does, if we go ahead and click that, is you can see there's a whole bunch of different things here, but one of the nice ones that you can do is just do sans serif. And basically, you'll see what this does in a second here. So if I save this, if I take a look at this and I look at this text, you can see here it's got like these little point things at the top here. All a sans serif does is it smooths them out. Hold on. That was for, let me do that for the H1 and we'll do that for H2 and the thing as well. And then we'll refresh it. And am I in the wrong file here? I think I might be on the wrong file. I think I'm on the wrong file. I'll try and find that file again. But basically what the font family will do is it'll let you change the font type. So if you have a serif font, which is basically those little things that are at the top of the page, it'll let you change it to a sans serif font, which basically gets rid of those, makes it a little bit nicer. You can also change the font size like we've seen, or yeah, the color. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes in the breakout rooms to try those out. So go ahead and write, you can just basically write a page about whatever you want. It can be about you, it can be about a game, it can be about anything. Try using the different elements that we have so far and also try styling them differently to make them look a little bit different and try playing around with the different options that are available from there. So we'll give you guys another 3 or 4 minutes to try that out. So yeah, so basically all that I did for mine was I just came through and just changed it to make it look a little bit more like what we had there. So it's basically just basically just the same idea. So we have an H1 tag at the top, then a couple of paragraph tags, an unordered list, and an anchor tag inside of an H4. And then all that I've done for this is for the body tags. Like I said, you can target any element. So in this case, we target the body tag, which is what some people do a lot of times. And what you'll do is you can change the font family in this case, for example, or you can change the background color and then the actual color inside that, which changed basically everything down to white. And then for the anchor links, I've made the colors into green. So it looks green when you're going over it. Okay. So there are a ton of different styles that are actually universal. So one of them is height or width. So obviously you can set the height or the width of an element to whatever you need to do. One handy way to do this is by doing it by percentages. So you can see here, this first one we have is 100% width, and then this one is a 50% width. So this example is available in the measurements example. So if I go ahead, take a look at the measurement example, we can see here, oops. What's happening with my mouse? There we go. So you can see here the width here is 50% and the width here is 25%. And then the way that this is, the way that I took the screenshot makes it look like it's 100% width, but it's actually 50. And so basically at this point, you can see here that they're taking up different sizes. And basically all you do for that is you just say height and width, and then you put whatever the units are. There's also the option to do max. So basically as you're coming through here and you're taking a look at this, instead of saying width, you can say max width. And then what'll happen is that if something gets smaller, then it will go smaller, or it will go to a maximum of that size if it fills the whole content inside whatever the outer element is at that point. So at this point, it's probably good to mention there are a ton of different measurement units. So VH is the vertical height, or some people call it the vertical height. So the viewpoint height is what it's actually called. So essentially what it is it's like the amount of the screen that you're dealing with. So if you make something, for example, a viewport height of 100, it will be a 100 width of whatever your scrolling height is. So when you're taking a look at your page, obviously like with this page, for example, there is a certain amount of height before I have to scroll. 100 VH will be 100% of that height there. So 100 VH will be one scrolling width of, or one scrolling height of whatever that, whatever size your browser is at that point. Vertical width or viewpoint width is the exact same idea. So at this point, the viewport is basically means it's the same thing. So it's essentially 100% of the width of your current viewport. Obviously, you can scroll vertical and horizontal. So if you have more than 100% of the width of the viewport, then what you'll get is you'll have to scroll horizontally as well. Percentage is to whatever parent. So for example, if you had something that was inside of a div and that div was like, so let's say, for example, this body element here, let's say this was instead only taking up 50 VW, so it'd be 50% of the width of the page. And then I had an element in here that was 50%. It's saying 50% of whatever the element is that's above it. So if I had like a div here, for example, and then I had an h1 tag inside here, and for this one, I had a width of 50 VW, which is the viewport width. And then in this case, I had style is equal to width of 50%. What this means is that it's 50% of this width. So it's 50% of 50 VW, which would be 25 VW in this case. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing percentages versus actual viewport width. Oftentimes, whenever you're dealing with any viewport widths or viewport heights, you want to do that for whatever the very topmost element is of something. And then whatever you're doing inside that, you'll want to do percentages because it makes it pretty easier to understand. EM basically just means make it bigger than its default size. So for example, when we've been saying 3 EM, that basically says make it 3 times its default size. So you just basically take whatever the default size is, multiply it by that, whatever the number is you put in front of EM, and it'll show up there. And then PX is the size in pixels. Be careful if you're doing anything size of the pixels. If you make something 500 pixels wide, for example, it might look great on a laptop screen or it might look great on a computer screen. If you go to a phone, it's not going to look very good because it's 500 pixels wide, regardless of what device you're on. So just be careful with that. And then, yeah, so this is an example here. So what we've done with this one is we've made the viewport height. So we made the height of the div that's outside it. We've made it 100 VH and we've made it black. And then we've made the inner color white. And then we've aligned the text to center. And what this is doing is this will take up 1 viewport height here. So if I go ahead and I open up this file, so that's going to be in examples and under measurements here. That's the right example. Try to find that one. I don't think we have that example in here anymore. We'll add that example in after this, but essentially what this will do is it'll take up 1 viewport height. So basically this 1 viewport height height will be essentially the will be colored black at that point with this code right here. And this text align basically tells you to, instead of had the text start from the left, you start from the middle instead, and it goes outward from there. So it expands outward from the middle instead of going from the left and then expanding to the right. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is element spacing. So when you're looking at an element, there are a ton of different layers of spacing that exist when you're dealing with elements. That makes it a little bit more complicated than just sort of picking spacing, whatever you want to add it in there. So essentially, you start with whatever the width of the element actually is itself. That'll typically be determined by how much is inside the element. So if you're dealing with text, for example, the width of this text is determined by how much text is inside it. That's how much width it's taking up by default. But then on top of that, you then have the stuff that lives outside of it. So you have the padding, the border, which we're not going to talk about too much, and then you have the margin. So these exist for every element, by the way. This isn't just text elements. This is for literally every single element will have these things applied to them. So just keep that in mind. So the first one is padding. So like we saw in this example right here, in this diagram right here, padding is the first layer immediately after the element size. So when we're taking a look at this, let's say that we have something that starts like a div, for example, that in this case, the div is colored black. And then we start with it being 25 width and 25 height. Divs are also handy, by the way, for making squares. So if you want to make a square in something, it's very handy. Just make it a div, make it a certain width and height, and it'll make a square for you. So by default, it starts with 25 by 25 pixels. So it's a perfect square like that. When we add the padding, we can add it to the top, the left, the right, or the bottom. And essentially, if we add 5 pixels of padding around it, what will happen is that the elements that are inside that div will expand to wherever the padding is and the element width. So when you're dealing with any of the content inside of it, that padding will essentially make it so that whatever is the background color in this case, for example, will expand to that padding as well. That's different than when we talk about something like the margin, which is what we're talking about after this, which will expand outside of the content. So if we're taking a look at this element spacing right here, everything in these 2 layers will respect whatever the background color is. So if you have some black, like a black background color, for example, and it starts with 25 by 25, and then you go through and you add 5 pixels of padding to each side. Now you have a 30 pixel box that's black. But if you add margin on top of that, the black won't extend out to the margin, but the margin will push everything else out from there. So just keep that in mind when you're going through. So if we're taking a look at this, for example, this example, we have a 30 by 30 pixel block because we're expanding in 5 pixels in all directions. But in this case, we still only have a 30 by 30 pixel block because we're expanding with the padding out in those directions. But then the margin that's adding out from there would mean that we have 5 pixels in any direction that's going to be white again, or whatever the background color is in that case. So just keep that in mind when you're going through. If you see something and you're seeing, oh, the color's not showing up, it's because you did margin instead of padding. If you see something and you don't want the color to extend that far and you want to just add spaces that don't include whatever the colors are that you're dealing with, add in margin. And also, if you want to do something like this, by the way, you can also just say do it in one call. So if we wanted to do this instead of doing top, left, right, bottom, we could just say padding, colon 5 pixels, and that'll do all 4 sides at once. Same thing with margin. Some other common styles that we've seen. So color, some of the units that you can use to do color. So in this case, we've had green show up right here, for example. But if you actually, this is actually one of the handy things about Visual Studio Code, is we can come in here and we can select stuff and we can drag it around and whatnot. So this is called RGBA. So in this case, we're saying that it's 51 out of 255 red, 255 green. So it's the most green it could possibly be. And it's 51 blue in this case. So basically that's to do with this slider. If we change this slider, those numbers you see at the top there will change. But then also with this, we can add in the A value, which is called alpha, which is for transparency. And it's basically just percent. So at this point, 0.914 means 91% transparency in that case. So it's a little bit more transparent. And then we can do the same thing that we saw before, where you can type in like green and it can show up like that. A ton of colors are supported that way. Or you can do what's called hex values, which is where you just type in hash and then you'll see some numbers. You'll see a couple of people will post things like this. So 14, 14, 14, for example, is super dark. And that's basically, some people will post in hex values. You can just use them to copy across like that. All those different values as well will work for background color and any other sort of color elements you'll see. All of those options will be available for all of those. On top of that, we then have text align. Text alignment, like I talked about before. If you want left, you'll start from the left. If you want center, start from the center. If you want right, you'll start from the right, and it'll expand to the left. Line height is just basically how much space each line should take up. So you start at 1. If you add more to it, then from there, what that'll do is that'll expand the amount of space for each character. So it'll basically it'll give you more space for each lines if you want to do that. Font size will change the size of the text. Font family will change your font family. So like you saw here, for example, so if we take a look at this page here, this is what's the sans serif that I was talking about before. So you can see I've added that into the top here. If I go ahead and get rid of that, then by default, it'll use a serif font, and we'll see it now changes and it's got this, like all the stuff on here. Okay. Oops. Wrong one. That's the one. Here we go. And yeah, a lot of these will also work in divs as well. So if you want to put them on divs, it'll happen to all the content inside that div as well. So yeah, elements with any in your HTML will have CSS effects that'll cascade down from the parents downwards. Basically, the way that this works in terms of the calculations for it are kind of complicated. The easiest rule of thumb is that if something isn't working, if you do inline, which is where you add it to the element itself, it'll take the most precedence. And then anything else, it'll go up in precedence from there. There is a full reference available here. There are so many different rules for this. If you're running into problems with this, Googling is going to be the best way to deal with this. I'm going to be entirely honest with you, because it's really complicated to try and deal with precedence. So just keep that in mind. If you see something weird that's happening and you need it to just work for you, put it inline on the element and it'll work from there. And if it doesn't work inline on the elements, then you can add an exclamation point important, which, as you can imagine, basically says, this is important, always do this. But obviously, if you do that with everything, then everything becomes important and then nothing becomes important. So just be careful when you're going through. And then the order for the actual showing up, it goes inline is most important, then style tags, then files. So just keep that in mind. So there's a ton of resources. Like I said before, CSS is really complicated. So there's a ton of different resources that we've listed here where you can go to get more information about CSS and more of the sort of options that are available. But now the question is, okay, well, how can we learn from existing web pages? So we know that there's pages that already exist. How can we learn about them? So this is how to steal like a developer. Oftentimes when you're trying to figure something out, if you're trying to see, somebody says, for example, somebody asks you to do something, like if you're working a job and somebody says, hey, I want you to do this thing that's kind of like what Facebook does. Easiest way to figure it out, go to Facebook and see what they're doing. Like I said, everything that shows up in your browser is on your browser. It actually loads and renders from your browser itself. So if you want to figure out what's going on, ask your browser what's going on, and it'll tell you exactly what's going on. You can learn that way. Exactly, professional plagiarism. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about DevTools. And so DevTools will basically come with basically any browser, and we're just going to go through there, and it's just going to tell you, everything about the HTML, the CSS that we're working with, as well as the JavaScript. It can tell you about the network traffic, the network performance, the way that things are loading in. It can let you do performance auditing. These days, there's actually fancy testing tools. So if you're ever testing an application, you can record different movements that you're doing in the browser and then play them back through the browser. The data that the site is storing about you in some cases. There's a ton of other stuff that you can take a look at inside the browser. The browser gives you a ton of information that's available as you're using it. So first thing, like everybody was saying, the easiest way to get Roblox, right click, inspect element, and then change the text. So if we're taking a look at the Schulk Ignite site, for example, if you want to see what's going on here, how this text works, all we have to do is just right click on this text and then hit inspect. And it'll show up in there and it'll tell us, okay, look, this is a div that has some stuff on it and then it has a span. Cool, now we know how that works. And then obviously if you want in page, you can change this stuff around. So if we wanted to change that text, then we can just do it directly through there in the DevTools. But this is how you can find out what's going on. The other thing that's super handy about this, if we take a look down here, is the styles. This can tell you all the things that are going on with the CSS inside here. Now, obviously, with the Schulk Ignite site, this is much more complicated than the stuff that we've been looking at so far. But if we take a look, for example, at this site that I was doing before, if we go ahead, hit F12, in my case, that'll open up the DevTools. And we can either right click like I showed before and do inspect, or we can actually just click this button here. And this will let us have like a hover. It'll show us all the things as we're going. We can click on one and then it'll highlight it for us and we can find it in there. So let's say, for example, we're wondering, okay, I don't know why this isn't showing up properly, right? This is an H4. Why isn't this showing up properly, right? I can take a look at it. I can be like, okay, what's going on? I don't understand. The color is white. Why isn't this showing up? Well, if we click on the anchor tag, we can see as we're going through, oh, look, the color has been axed out. Why is the color axed out? Well, if we scroll up, oh, right, I forgot. I accidentally put this on here. So now if we go back to the code, I can see in my code, right, I forgot that I changed the color here, which is why I can't see it. So it's going to be super handy for debugging any CSS stuff that's going on. Or if you want to see what the effects of something are without having to constantly save and then reopen the file, you can also just do it in here. So if I uncheck that, I can see what it looks like. Great. But now the question is, okay, well, that looks awful. How do I change it to look like something else? Well, we can just do the same thing we do with normal CSS. Come in here, change to green. Oh, okay, that's what it would look like. All right, well, that looks kind of small. What if I tried to make it larger? Okay, well, I can just start typing stuff in here. Look at that. So now I can just see, okay, well, how big is extra large? It's kind of big, but it's not very big. Maybe extra large. Maybe instead I'll just do 6EM and see what that looks like. Yeah, there we go. That's what I want. This is what real design looks like. So yeah, basically you can come in here, you can change around what everything looks like, and you can see what the effects of those things are going to be before you actually add them in your code, which is super handy to figure out what's going on. You can also then, if you want to deconstruct what's happening in a site, so we can see this span class is showing up and you're like, I don't know what border box does. If I check that off, what happens? Well, there's multiple ones. So if I check that off, what happens? Oh, wow, everything breaks if I check that off. Okay, maybe I'll remember not to remove that line of my CSS. And then as we're going through, you can also see the line numbers in here. So in this case, these are all SCSS, which doesn't help us because you guys don't know what that is. So let's take a look. We can see it in here. It's not going to give us the number. If you have a CSS file, it'll actually give you the file like line number in there, which you can then go back to and reference it, which is very handy in situations where you have very long CSS files because you'll say like, you know, main.css and then it'll say colon 675 and then you know, okay, on line 675 that's where this thing is designed from. So I can just go through and take a look at it from there. And if you ever want to see what everything that's available looks like, so you can see in here we have elements, and then if for me it's right here, but there's sometimes if you have a larger screen it'll actually show up with different tabs. But I can click here, and for example, if I go to sources, I can actually just see all the things that happen. So you can see here, there's a ton of stuff that loads when we load Schulk Ignite. You can see here, oh, look, there's a bunch of CSS files with a whole bunch of information on here. So SCSS, SCSS, all these different things inside here, or CSS inputs. We can see these are all the different CSS files that are available here, right? So you can see all that information through the DevTools directly. So yeah, this is the same thing that I was just talking about. And if you do end up making changes, so let's say, for example, I like how this site looks right now, right? My site looks perfect. This is exactly what we want. This is what everybody wants to see on the internet. This is what we want to see. Because this is a static site and because we just have the content that we have here, what we can actually do is we can actually right click and then we can go save as. And in this case, what it'll let us do is if we go to our desktop and we say my awesome site and I hit save, you can see here it's downloaded the HTML file. And if I click on this HTML file, we can see here's what the HTML file looks like from here. Hello, it's the ghost of Shuluk Night Future here to talk to you about this. So, that demo that I just showed you, you could see there that the changes didn't actually persist. And the reason for that is when you're coming in and saving changes, what happens here is if I go ahead and I click this, for example, if you saw in that previous example, nothing changed. And that was because I changed it right here. And the problem with this is that it doesn't actually update style sheets when you do this. What you have to actually do is in this element.style, this is where you need to make the change. So I need to say color, and then I would say green. And the reason why is that when we do this, you can see here it actually changes the HTML and it adds an inline style tag. And that's what we need in order for those changes to show up for us. So if you want to make those changes and have them persist, you have to do it in this element.style section at the top here, which will essentially add it inline to your element. Now, if I go ahead and I Control S and I save this and I save it to my desktop, for example, and then I go ahead and click it, now we'll see the changes have persisted, just like that. So that's what you need to do that. Now, if we wanted to export what the changes look like from here, now what we can do is we can hit F12. Oops, sorry, we hit F12, and we wanted to come in here and let's say we want to change. We want to get this information. We actually right-click this body, and if we just do copy the element, we can come in here, and if we highlight the body now, hit paste. Now those changes that we made will be in there, and then we're good to go. So you can basically just copy the changes that you make as you go. You can also, if you want to see what the changes to HTML would be as you're going through, you can hit edit as HTML like that, and you can start typing HTML in there directly to see what changes and how it changes from there. Okay. Yeah, and this just tells the same thing. You can also just press Control S. Just do Control S, it'll do the same thing, and it'll just save it out from there. Keep in mind, this doesn't always work. If people have things that are behind servers, you won't be able to save those out. So for example, if somebody has a bunch of files that are being loaded from the server and the server is set up in a way that securely only renders it when like the site itself asks for it, none of that will load. Oftentimes you won't have images that'll come through and do all that stuff. This stuff is mostly for debugging and figuring stuff out. I would not recommend this as like a way to learn how to do web development. Although it's kind of fun way to see what's going on, I would not recommend designing an entire web page inside the browser and then exporting it out. Mostly for, well, there's a bunch of different reasons for this. Mostly it might not work. And also if you accidentally control, I've done this before because I used to do this with sites. If you accidentally control if you press Control W, for example, it'll automatically close your tab. If you accidentally, let's say, hypothetically speaking, spill a water bottle, and then accidentally hit Control W on your keyboard as you go, you have now lost the entirety of your web page that you built because it was just in the browser at the time. So be very careful when you're using this. It's very handy for learning things, but don't rely on it to do all of your development work. So today we covered the topics. So basically we covered the basics of HTML and CSS. Next week, we're going to get into some fancier CSS. You can see down here what we're going to cover next week. And yeah, we're going to talk about mobile support. Yeah, we're going to talk about like all that stuff next week. And we're going to talk about how to write CSS a little bit quickly. Because as you can tell, just by how we've gone so far, writing a lot of CSS and making something that looks like this is going to be a little bit complicated if we're doing it line by line. So what can we do to make that faster? What can we do to get things up and running really quickly? We're going to talk about that next week and go from there. But for this week, I think there is one more thing. Yeah. So for this week, we do have the Discord set up and ready to go at this point. So I will let Fanny, do you want to give details for this? Just because I don't have the extra stuff. I'm not sure if it's in the slides or not.
If you go to the slide after this.
Okay, perfect. So what I'll do here is I'll actually copy this link for you guys and chuck it in chat. We'll send it off in here. So if you just go ahead and join that, and then from there, these are the steps to get yourself set up with everything. So you should have your group name and everything like that. And let me just go back into slideshow mode. That's basically everything for today. So if you manage to go and get yourself set up on the Discord, that's basically the last thing that we're going to cover for today. And you're good to go. For mentors, I'll need you guys to stick around for another little bit after this, just for a debrief. And yeah, thanks for coming. So I'll leave this up for you guys as we're trickling out with mentees. And then, yeah, just mentors, if you can just stick around for a little bit, we'll talk about everything from there. We'll keep everybody in here. We'll give you guys another minute or two just to sign up for the Discord, or if you have any lingering questions that you want to ask at the end of this. And if not, you guys are good to go. There will be a recording for today's lecture. What you'll actually see, that's a good point. If you go on the Shuluk Ignite website and you come under the sessions and then under Ignite Web Dev, you'll see this is what shows up here. And what'll happen is the session 0 was re-recorded. So what you'll see here is there'll be a little play button that shows up right next to this, and that'll be where the recording will be there. So if you come onto this page in probably tomorrow, since I'll be posting the recordings, you'll see here there'll be a little play button that shows up next to these, and that'll be where the recordings are posted. Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody else has any other questions. Go ahead and stop the recording now.